Hi everyone and welcome. What you see right here is my 74-day-old African nightcrawler worm system, and it's been 8 days since we last checked in on this system, so I figured it's probably time to see how it's doing as far as food supply, whether it's holding up or if it needs some more food today. And today is the first time that we're not going to be checking in on the bin's corresponding nursery bin anymore. Because it was 8 days ago when we last checked in on the worm bin that we had made one final inspection of the castings that the worms had been occupying previously, and we had done a final haul out of the baby worms that were baited out of the material. And at this point, this is no longer in service. So I've been using sort of this new system here that just pretty much turns the label upside down to indicate to me that this is no longer an active bin anymore. And since I do have one other system that's currently serving the function of nursery bin, I've decided that I'm going to go with this vertical orientation of the label to indicate to me that that bin is still on the way to being completed. So that's how I'm going to distinguish active composting systems from systems that are now only just holding the finished castings and cocoons, waiting for babies to hatch, and systems that are now truly finished and are no longer in service. They're just sitting here waiting to be emptied, which hopefully I'll get around to doing soon. And just another point of discussion in my comments lately. People have been noting how I've been making a concerted effort to transition away from plastic coverings and get all of my active worm bins to the point where they're covered only with paper and cardboard and no more plastic. And that's pretty much where we're at with most of my systems, except in certain cases, such as my newest European nightcrawler bin, where I do have plastic, trying to preserve the moisture in that fairly new bin up until such a time that I feel confident that the contents of the bin alone can hold on to their moisture on their own. Here I've got a newly built bin which has not even been populated yet. There too, the plastic is just trying to keep the moisture in so that that system can kind of prime and eventually accept worms. And at some point in the future it'll have its plastic covering replaced with paper and cardboard. And the only other place that I'm using plastic coverings are in these completed bins where I'm doing nothing more than just storing castings. So hopefully that helps clarify what my mindset and thinking is on the whole topic of covering bins, because it has been sort of a hot topic here in my wormery lately, and that's kind of what I'm working on in terms of a standard process nowadays. And I think it's going to work well. So I'd love to hear people's ideas on that. So let's proceed with getting the African nightcrawlers up here on the bench, see how they're holding up as far as food supply, and if needed, we'll bring down some more food for them and get it into the bin for them. So it is always fun reading the comments to the videos that I put online, because people are always out there keeping me honest. I do, kind of voice my opinion on where I'm headed with things and what I'd like to try to accomplish. So when I say I'm going to be gravitating away from plastic coverings and trying to cover my bins with, some sort of materials that allow for a lot more airflow. Every time someone spots out of the corner of their eye or in the corner of the screen on one of my videos something that doesn't jive with what I've been saying, I usually get called out on it, so I do appreciate that. Thank you for keeping me honest. Well, let's get a little bit closer in here so we can see what's going on with this African nightcrawler bin. So now 8 days since it was last fed. I'm not sure where it's going to stand as far as food is concerned. I do remember that a lot of the foods that were placed in here 8 days ago were stuff like strawberries and mango peels and cucumber shavings and a number of different things that I would assume the worms probably really like. So I guess there's always that possibility that there's very little food remaining. We got a little visitor to the bin, a spider. I don't often see spiders in my worm bins. I don't really have a issue with spiders. They they definitely help get rid of the flying insects in a place. And I'm just going to put them over by the windowsill. Probably do better hunting over there. Some people are probably like, what are you, crazy? You're just letting bugs loose in your house? Well, I'm in my basement. And, you know, I do have a wormery. So it's not too unusual that, you know, some insects are going to be drawn to what's going on over here. And, you know, I don't object to that. I don't worry too much about it. I guess if things got a little bit out of hand, then I would worry. Especially since I've got tenants that live up on the second floor of the house. I would not want to have the house suddenly infested with all kinds of creepy crawly nasties. So while I do have a certain amount of tolerance for certain types of insects and certain quantities, I'm not going to worry too much about it, especially when it comes to a really beneficial type of an insect like a spider. Man, oh man, look at all these beautiful castings. You know, 74 days old. What is that? It's about 2.5 months old, so I shouldn't be so surprised. But it feels so cool when you like reach down into the material and it's like all loose and flaky, and such a departure from what I'm used to lately. You know, for a while there with the plastic coverings, my bins were just tending to run way too damp. The material in the bins was just always really, you know, sticky and clumping together. But here we've got pretty much what would be considered sort of the ideal situation. And maybe at first glance you would think that the stuff is just too dry, otherwise it wouldn't crumble so readily. But you can see there's worms throughout the stuff, no matter where you look. I mean, the feeding would have been applied right down the middle, but even as we examine the outskirts of the bin, all the way on the far edge, furthest away from where the feedings have been getting applied, the material is just crawling with worms that seem to be totally content with hanging in this material and enjoying it. So that's really nice to see, I must say. So this is just me doing what I do, you know. If it was just a matter of plopping in some food to make sure that they're okay for the next, you know, 10 or 12 or whatever days, then we'd be done by now. But I'm always the curious type. I can't seem to resist poking around and seeing how things are doing in my bins. But that's really cool. And you know, when I was in here last, I do remember a lot of stuff like this floating around on the top surface. A little bit different from what I've been trying to do lately, which is to try to keep the appearance of my bins nice and natural. So I've been trying to, you know, use a lot of leafy type stuff as the top covering in my bins. So I've got my box of leaves, which is running low again, so I'll have to restock, but I think I've got enough in that box to do a nice top covering of leaves in this bin after we finish working on it today. I'm assuming we're probably going to need to apply some food, because all those yummy things that were put in here 8 days ago, combined with the estimated population of worms in this bin, which I believe is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,000 worms, should equate to not a lot of leftovers. But we'll see when we get in there. So I figured I would try to salvage a lot of this chunks of, you know, cardboard bits and paper bits, set them off to the side, and we'll use those as sort of a foundation to plop today's feeding on top of once we get there. Once again, you could see worms throughout this material, really enjoying it. And once again, just lots and lots of castings everywhere. Really nice, loose, fluffy stuff. Very nice. I'm kind of saving the feeding section, the feeding area down the middle for last. And, you know, if this was a bin of red wigglers or maybe Indian blue worms, a type of worm that has a tendency to kind of mob around the food supply, then we'd probably be in for a big surprise. But I've already kind of grown accustomed to what to expect when I'm checking in on my nightcrawler bins. It just seems like the nightcrawlers are just as content to be elsewhere in the bin other than where the most recent supply of kitchen scraps were deposited for them to eat. Because they seem perfectly content just to feed on, you know, the bedding materials throughout the bin. so you don't find them really crowding around trying to get at the food. The food eventually does get consumed, but I just don't get that sense that the nightcrawlers are that jazzed about it. They're just as happy to nibble away on the bedding materials that make up the bin. So as we start to work our way down, I mean, we're almost at the bottom already, and I do remember a pretty good amount of food being dumped in here. Like I said earlier, strawberry bits, mango peels, cucumber peels, and other types of little small particle sized kitchen scraps, cuttings from different types of vegetables and whatnot, but I'm a little bit surprised to not really see any in here at all. I mean, there are a good number of worms actually hanging out down here, so it's a little bit surprising too. But then again, like I said earlier, this is a pretty heavily populated bin, a good couple thousand worms living in here, based on my best estimate. So it's not too surprising that we're not finding many leftovers in here. Yeah, I'm glad that we're coming back in here. I almost held off on checking in on this bin today, thinking that 8 days might not have been sufficient for them to do away with the last feeding, but it does seem like they're due for a little bit more replenishment of food. And I even held off on bringing food down here. I figured I would check first before grabbing some stuff out of the freezer and bringing it down here, just in case there was still a whole bunch of leftovers, and then we would maybe skip or hold off for a few more days. But I believe it is going to be necessary to bring a whole bunch of additional food down here to give these little guys, because it looks like we got some pretty hungry mouths to feed, and a whole bunch of them here too. So we've already kind of opened up a nice opening here for these worms to... Oh, there's a mango peel. We finally found a piece of leftover food from the last feeding. How do you like that? Maybe there are little pockets of scraps here remaining. I just found another one, so there we go. Certainly not much though, that's for sure, compared to what was placed in here last time, which from what I remember was a pretty generous portion. So I think I will come down here with another pretty generous portion for them so that they have enough to sustain them for another week or two. So let me, oops, don't want to have any worms on my glove. There's a little baby nightcrawler, 2 of them stuck to my glove. How do you like that? All right, just want to make sure I'm not taking any little hitchhikers that could potentially drop off while I'm in transit up to the kitchen. Just want to keep them where they're going to be nice and safe and cozy while I step away for a minute. So I will be right back. So what you see here is kind of your typical feeding down here in my wormery. In most cases, there's a coffee filter with the coffee in it. And the rest of what you see in here is almost all frozen stuff out of the freezer. And the only stuff that's not frozen are these stems of tomato. And this piece of plastic, is it plastic or is it just ice? I think it's plastic, so I'm going to exclude it, toss it to the side. So I'm really starting to, I was kind of scraping the bottom. All this tiny particle matter is the stuff that falls to the bottom of the plastic bag that I keep all the kitchen scraps in that are intended for the worms. So I did my best to just pull out a whole bunch of that from the bottom. And then a couple larger chunks are some more peelings off of mango, and this is like the stem end of a head of cabbage, I believe. Since it was frozen, it'll probably break down a little bit more readily than if it was just placed in here fresh. So, like we said earlier, we're going to drop in some bedding to go right beneath where the food's going to get put in. And we definitely succeeded in collecting a good amount of it over here on the side. And I think I would like to see it submerged below the food so that the worms could work it rather than being out on the surface where it doesn't get quite as much attention. All this nice bedding, the worms will definitely appreciate it. And I guess just cosmetic appeal wise, right? I like the appearance of the bin when the top surface is a little bit more natural materials rather than all these manufactured materials. Yeah, from the worms' perspective, they don't care. It's all the same to them. In fact, I would almost imagine that a lot of these manufactured materials, all these pieces of paper and cardboard, all the stuff that's made out of wood pulp, basically, is probably among their favorite foods. Because it's all really fine material. Once it gets a little bit damp, once the material gets impregnated with some juices from some nice thawing fruits and veggies like what we have for them here, I'm sure the stuff becomes irresistible to the worms. So you can see a lot of this stuff is already collecting frost from just being out here in the humid air. Or maybe it just collected frost from being in the freezer. But most of it is really, really tiny bite-sized stuff or thin, leafy stuff. The only stuff in here that might take a little bit of time are these tomato stems. I'll be curious to see how long it takes for them to break those down. And maybe this stem of the head of cabbage. I could see that taking a little bit longer, but I would imagine that all the rest of this stuff in here is probably going to go pretty quick. So, I think before we start covering things up, we're going to apply some of what I use as grit in my worm bins, which is the pulverized eggshell. And I think that this bin, over the past 2.5 months that it's been in service, I think they've probably gotten grit on almost every occasion each time I fed. So there's probably a whole bunch of grit floating around in this system that the worms could take advantage of, but I see no harm in applying a little bit more whenever possible. And right now I do have a pretty good supply of it on hand, so I'm being pretty generous when it comes to the grit. So I'm gonna take this coffee filter and try to fragment it into little tiny pieces of paper, just to continue with the whole theme of applying copious amounts of bedding to my worm bins, especially these nightcrawler bins where the worms really do seem to favor the carbon-rich food sources, such as the materials that are typically used as bedding in the bins. And let's see, what else do we have? We've got the leaves that we're going to cover up with at the end, I guess, right? Yeah, but I'm just trying to see if I can scrap up some of these additional chunks of cardboard paper that I see out on the top surface to get them down into the feeding area where they'll get the attention they deserve. So that's a pretty nice, generous feeding, I think. But like you saw, I mean, we had very little leftovers from the last feeding that was only 8 days ago in this bin. So this does seem like a very capable bin when it comes to the breakdown of materials. So I'm not worried. I got a feeling if we were to even come back in here in a week's time, we'd probably find very few leftovers. So it'll probably be another 8 or 10 days next time we check in here, if not sooner. And at that point, I'm sure they'll be needing some more food. But before we cover up here, I guess the last thing that I'd like to apply onto here is the beautification layer. I don't know why. I just like the appearance of leaves when I open up a worm bin. It just seems like the way to do it. I guess it really also depends on basically what you have on hand, which is, in my case, leaves. That's what I've got on hand. Some people have tons and tons of paper from their office, and they've got a nice shredder that makes it all into tiny particle matter. And in those cases, they use paper as bedding. Me, I've got a nice collection of leaves outside that I pulled together last autumn after all the leaves fell and the leaves dried. I took my leaf vac and I sucked them all up and put them in bags, giving me a pretty good supply of bedding for my worm bins. All right, we're done here. I'm restoring this coffee filter as an indication of where we fed, which was right down the middle here. And my typical coverings of paper and cardboard. And you know, since we're not covering with plastic, if there were plastic covering here, this paper would be soaked and it would be mobbed with worms and they'd be nibbling away at it nonstop. But these paper coverings seem to last quite a while when they're not completely soaked. So, yeah, but I still think between those couple paper layers and the cardboard layer, they do seem to do a nice job preserving the moisture content of the bin, while also allowing enough airflow to keep things nice and cozy. Okay, well, that's it for today, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.